Hello and welcome to Unsupervised Thinking, a podcast on neuroscience, artificial intelligence, and science more broadly. We are a group of computational neuroscientists. I'm Grace.
I'm Connor.
And I'm Josh.
And for this episode, we are talking about the biology of gender. And this is stemming from an episode that we did a few months ago, episode 16, which was a joint episode with the people from the Always Already podcast. And that's a critical theory podcast. And so for that, we were talking about the science of gender and studying gender and science's role in society and a whole bunch of topics. And we read this book called Brainstorm by Rebecca Jordan-Young that was kind of something like an outsider's analysis of the science of how gender is studied. And they kind of disagreed with the conclusions that some people in the field have made. But that conversation, that episode, spanned a lot of different things and didn't really get into the details of the science in those studies. So we just wanted to loop back around to this topic and go through some of the ways that gender is studied in humans and in some other animals.
So I guess, in some sense, yeah, it's like our own curiosity led us to return to this topic because we felt like there was more for us to read about and discuss.
Yeah, and so to do that, we read a paper called The Biology of Human Psychosexual Differentiation by Lewis Gorin from 2006. And this paper, I think, was really well written and interesting and kind of doesn't fall prey to some of the issues that some papers in this field do. So none of us actively work in gender studies or the science of gender or anything like that, but I was looking through the literature to find a good source, and it was kind of difficult to find something great on this. And this guy is a doctor from the Netherlands who actually works with transgender people. He's worked with, according to Wikipedia, over 2,000 transgender people. And so his approach is one that comes with maybe more understanding of the human level or the subjective experience of these issues than kind of a purely scientific standpoint, or maybe like a scientific standpoint that would have come from previous eras. So I thought this was a really nice read for this topic.
Do you want to introduce the second paper as well?
Sure. The other one that we read, which is a paper that was cited by the first one, is Hormonal Influences on Sexually Differentiated Behavior in Non-Human Primates by Kim Wallen. And so this is a more purely scientific one that goes over a lot of studies related to behavior in macaque monkeys.
And I guess maybe to motivate the connection, obviously the second one was cited by the first one, as you said, but there's a sense in which, and we'll talk about some of the details, but in the first review, there's a review of many findings in the literature on gender and sexuality and biology, and one of the sort of conclusions is that a lot of the results are relatively weak, with the exception of there being potentially very clear and dramatic effects around androgen exposure early in life or early in development.
So androgens are just like the general class of things like testosterone, like more masculine hormones. Obviously all these terms come with conclusions baked into them.
Implied, yeah. So androgen means male.
Yeah.
But
it generally refers
the
to
male generating hormones, basically.
It refers to testosterone and dihydrotestosterone and this class of things.
And so one of the classes of findings that seems most robust under scrutiny is something about, let's say, we'll get into the technical distinctions more, but like masculinization as a consequence of androgens early in life or early in development. And this macaque study does, kind of says some interesting things, not all of which we're not making claims that this all carries over to humans, of course, but just it says some interesting things about primate development with respect to androgens. So it kind of goes into more detail on that topic. So I guess we can start with the first review and then make our way to the second paper later.
Yeah, and so obviously there's a lot of reasons why these kinds of questions about gender are actually very difficult to study in humans. I mean, I think people, the naive question that most people have, which is kind of what these things are interested in as well, is to what extent is gendered behavior something that is baked in from the start, or something that is primarily influenced by society and expectations that you're given to behave a certain way. So you would want to be able to kind of raise humans in isolation and see if they still show differences along lines of, males behave one way more often and females behave a different way. But obviously you can't do that kind of thing. And so it's easier to approach with animals, but then there's complications about maybe what is gender in animals, because you can't actually ask a macaque if they identify as female or if they identify as male. And also we can get into some of the issues with studying this with even lower mammals. So, a lot of
rodents or something.
A lot of work is done in rodents in neuroscience and in biology. And sometimes there's no strong reason to believe that those things aren't broadly applicable to humans, but in certain cases there are clear differences that have been identified, and so they make extrapolation from rodents more difficult. But yeah, so let's start, I guess, with, I kind of liked the way that this Lewis Gorin started the paper, which was more talking about, kind of his experience in a way interacting with people who are trans or who have gender identity issues, and he gave some kind of interesting facts about those topics, and it gave a kind of broader, more maybe humanistic intro to the topic than these papers normally have. So I guess one thing is that the terms that are used, sex refers usually to biological sex, so that's usually identified by chromosomes or genitalia at birth, and then gender is the way someone identifies, so female or male gender or variants of that. And then in this paper they say gender role refers to how gender is displayed. So you have kind of your internal gender identity, whatever that is, and then there are ways that you choose to display that, and those are your gender roles. Though some people use gender role to mean kind of the expectations that society has for people of different genders, but that can be called gender norms. So that we'll say that's what gender norms are, and gender roles are how you express your gender identity. So he talks about some things, and one of the things that he brings up is this idea of early versus late transsexualism or transgenderism. He uses transsexualism. And the idea that there are some people who, from a very young age, were displaying behavior that was typical of the other gender. So men who have an interest in female clothing from a young age or something like that. And then there's other people who, it seems like, maybe in their 40s, they all of a sudden develop an interest in perhaps identifying as the opposite gender. And so that these potentially are two different types of transgenderism. And he also says that in this later version, there's an idea that the male to female trans people potentially find it kind of erotically interesting to think of themselves as women, and that's a component to their desire to transition. He also says that these later transitions aren't as successful as people who have these properties early on, because
where success is defined as like personal satisfaction after transition. Yeah.
If they make a transition, how likely are they to be satisfied? The people who do so later in life might be less satisfied. But I wanted to bring this up because there's this, the phrase for this idea that a man is kind of attracted to the idea of himself as a woman is called Autoguider Philia. And I just was like, I hadn't heard of this idea, and so I was Googling it, and you kind of immediately see it's like a hot topic. It's a politically charged idea where there are certain researchers, such as the one that is cited in this article, that kind of claim this to be a large component for why these late transitioners have a desire to transition, and kind of it being causal in a way that
yeah, and I think there's a lot of I mean, even among researchers, it seems like there's a lot of sort of moral judgment that goes on, especially around this topic, where like this is, you know, related to something that I think by like, let's say, more conservative elements in society is viewed as like a perversion rather than a disorder.
Yeah.
No, I mean this is like a charged topic where that is the language of this debate.
To be clear, right? So he says in this paper that most transsexuals do not recognize themselves in the typology, in this kind of bipartite.
Yeah, the early
typology,
versus late.
right? So this is something that some other expert has proposed.
Yeah. So apparently there's some conflict, and we shouldn't get into this because it's not something that we know well. But there's apparently some conflict between this academic and an academic at Northwestern over how salient these taxonomy are for transsexual.
Yeah, so the guy who is a proponent of the early versus late dichotomy and the Autoguider Philia thing is called Blanchard.
There's a few. I mean, it's not.
Well,
it's not just
the one that's cited here and is kind of targeted. But no, I mean, I wanted to bring this up exactly for that reason, that these things are very debated, and this is a science that interacts heavily with the real world, and so. So when I looked at, so there's this blog called Whipping Girl. There's also a book by the same title that talks a lot about trans issues. And the post on this Autoguider Philia thing there was basically pointing out that in the studies that claim that this is, you know, a component to these people who transition late, the people who didn't report Autoguider Philia were kind of excused away as just not being honest in their reporting. That was the claim. And so obviously that's not appropriate science. You can't just take the people who don't fall in line with your results and say that they're lying. But it wasn't the case that no one reported that. It was just the claim that, you know, anyone who transitions late feels this, and also that's a motivating factor for their transition, that just seemed not supported. But when it gets translated into these studies, so like, yeah, that's a bad study if they really just excuse the people who didn't line up with what they wanted to say. But the problem is then, you know, a headline gets printed that like trans people are in love with themselves or something, like, you know, that's more degrading than even what the bad science is saying. Then there's obviously a pushback to say, no, that's not our experience, that's not representative of our population. But in a weird way, that's kind of saying that this Autoguider Philia is a bad thing. It seems like both parties are saying, you know, it's bad, and so trans people are bad, or it's bad, and we as trans people don't support it. And it gets very worked up. The whole field is worked up, and any kind of small statements are put into this context where they can have huge impacts because some people kind of want to malign others.
Yeah, I mean, this is now a dated joke, but there was the Seinfeld bit from one of his episodes where it's like people thought he was gay, and he's like that he was saying he's not gay, not that there's anything wrong with that.
Yeah, exactly.
Right. He wanted to disclaim that he wasn't criticizing gay people, but of course, like the joke was that by like even being kind of
like put off by the fact that someone thought he was
someone
gay.
might think he was gay, he was of course saying that like there seems like there's kind of something wrong with that. So he had to like say that there wasn't, but even saying that doesn't really fix the problem, fix the sense that you're conveying by making the first assertion.
And so that, you know, touches on how the science of gender is obviously like very complicated, because if you do it sloppily, there are real consequences and there'll be real pushback. But also it shows that it's hard, because if it is the case that you try to do a study on Autoguider Philia in an atmosphere where maybe like Christian people have been publicly saying how terrible that is, or, you know, it's in the atmosphere that this is a bad thing and that the trans population doesn't want everyone to think that that's how they feel, then even if you as a trans person did feel that way, you might say that you didn't, because you don't want to be contributing to the idea that that trans people feel that way. And so there's all these feedback loops when you're looking at human behavior and, you know, taking surveys of humans' opinions that can make all of this very complicated.
So I think we should get into some of the scientific details, but there's one other thing I want to say, because I think that this topic, though it sounds like we've started in a direction where we're talking about transsexualism, is not really related to, I mean, it's related to these things, but it's also, there's an interesting question lurking in there for me about, I would say, like, the sort of mainstream heterosexual population, which I think was an interesting one and puzzling one, which is like, as human beings, we find ourselves, and I think it's something that it's easy to elide over, right? As human beings who maybe do not have non-conforming sexual identities or orientations, we find ourselves with some identity and with some orientation, and it's possible that is entirely socially determined, but like obviously there are gender distinctions between the genders, and distinctions between the sort of sexual anatomy and sexual behavior. So it seems likely, I think, that a sort of a decent amount of sort of sexual identity and sexual behavior are determined in part biologically. And when you think about that, just for for an average heterosexual person, it implies that who you find attractive is like somehow determined by like perceptual features. To me, this at least seems to follow, and maybe there's a flaw in this reasoning. I mean, this is like sort of basic. I mean, we kind of like, I think colloquially people accept this, but like who you find attractive is determined by sort of perceptual features. And somewhere, like probably to some extent genetically, or developmentally, your brain is sort of popping in response to certain fairly innate things. I mean, like we accept this with animals, like certain birds find big feathers on a bird of the opposite gender attractive, and it's just
you can like trick them with like,
and you can trick them,
objects that
so like if you make
like
like an animal that looks like it. I mean, or how like in certain kinds of primates, you see that there are sort of large posteriors that get like inflamed when the animal is sexually receptive, or something like this. And it's like,
just to be clear, is this actually related to the study of gender, or are you conflating sexuality with gender or something?
Well, I mean, so this review talks both about the sort of biology of sexual orientation and sexual identity. And so here I'm mostly speaking about orientation and sexual behavior. But I mean, in the studies we're talking about, both sexual behavior and sexual identity are discussed. So
sexual identity or gender identity?
Well, okay. So
what do all these things mean? Like, I just
Well, that's the point of. I mean, that would ideally be the point of good science on this topic, is to pick apart what these different things are. I mean, sexual identity. I don't know if I have a sense of what that means. If you just meant identifying as male or female, then I would probably call that gender identity.
What do we want to know? Like, if we were
what
would we want to? Well, like, I would.
Yeah. So this is what I'm trying to get at. I mean, one of the things that I want to know, right, is in heterosexual people, what's going on developmentally or genetically or developmentally, that gives rise to an adult brain which finds only roughly 50% of the population like sexually appealing.
Do you mean like a heterosexual person today in America?
No. And so like obviously there's huge social cues. Like
So like a prior question is like,
I want to know. I mean, clearly these things interact. Well, okay. So clearly these things
annoyingly complicated. I find
okay. Well, let's say
frustrating.
let's like make it a concrete example.
So I mean, what I'm basically. I mean, I don't want like. Clearly, there are assumptions baked into the question that I'm asking.
Yeah.
But it feels like a reasonable question. If you accept that, like
I think I'm heterosexual mostly.
Yeah, I mean, so if you accept that there's like biological diversity in orientation, and that like clusters around heterosexuality, which is to say that like a decent, like potentially large majority of the population is predominantly heterosexual.
And you mean like would be in like all human societies, or has so far been in all human societies.
So like I'm saying, and obviously these things interact, and there are like social factors that amplify certain things that people find attractive or whatever. But I'm just saying, like, what if anything? I mean, I'm willing to phrase this open-mindedly. Yeah. What if anything goes on in a heterosexual person's brain that is, let's say, biologically determined? And if it turns out, like, maybe it turns out that the smell of the opposite gender is sufficient to find, like, you have hard-coded in you as a male, for example, that, like, there's a chemical set of, like, a set of smells that are, you know, predominantly excreted by females that, like, you find, like, sufficiently appealing somehow subconsciously that's like what determines sexual orientation. That's a testable hypothesis. I'm not claiming that it's true, right? And in some animals, I guess there's limited evidence that, like, smell is a, you know, strongly determining factor into mate preference or something like that. But, like, so, and in some birds, it's clearly, like, some visual cues related to, like, you know, plumage and ornamentation or something like this. So, like, in many animal species, we kind of have a sense that there are perceptual features that determine it. And in humans, presumably it's more subtle and plastic and like socially informed. So I'm not trying to make it like exclusively biological, but I guess, you know, the end of this rant is like, to what extent is there something in humans, however subtle, that's like largely biologically determined, that is the cue to determine.
So you want to know, like, the neuroscience of that process? Why?
Yeah, let's say the neuroscience of that in a broad sense.
But to me, I think the thing that's way before that, I think, and that's important. Like, I don't like talking about human nature, to be honest, because I just find it usually comes up in contexts that are just weird. It's kind of, why do we want to talk about it? Like, we already have a sense of how we should be behaving towards each other and stuff. So, like, maybe it's kind of like, it can be interesting in a sort of like some type of magically pure, oh, I'm just interested in understanding stuff. And I guess people are more interesting than a lot of other things, because I don't know why that is. I find.
Do you want to understand like a ball rolling down a hill, or do you want to understand like sexual orientation?
A lot of physicists claim to prefer understanding the ball rolling down a hill, but, you know, maybe they don't. Maybe they're lying. But to me, it's kind of like the way these questions. I'm not trying to make some like really annoyingly contemporary sounding statement, but like there is always some historical context to how and which questions about these kinds of things get posed, and they're questions about people's lives, and this happens to be a question. This set of questions around gender and sexuality and stuff happen to be questions that, you know, in the past have kind of been linked to various types of suffering, right? Like
oppression, like people use the results of this quote-unquote science to oppress others.
Exactly, or even just like not the science, just even like the topic, right? And then the scientific questions kind of arise in these contexts, and like whatever. I mean, I don't know what that means, but like, you know, it's just that.
So yeah, you're wary. I don't know. I mean, I think though, you know, there's like a bit of repression that like. If you're not willing to explore and understand where your own desires and interests like come from, it feels a little repressed to me. I mean, I don't mean that in like a.
I see. No, I'm totally willing to explore my own one. I mean, I do that all the time. I constantly explore. But like, I don't know. It's just like, yeah. So it's just kind of. Well, one question to me is kind of like, what are the boundaries? Like, are there constraints? Because when we say like biologically determined. I think that can only mean something quite weak, and I think it's I always find it dangerous to use the word just because it has so many connotations to people who aren't like thinking in a subtle way, you know. So I don't know. Maybe it seems
like when my
pedantic, but
so like when you're saying when my question was like what biologically determining factors are there, when someone like me says biologically determining, I mean not like fully determining. I mean like. Yeah. Determining refers to like a contributing factor.
Yeah, and the contributing factor could be like very weak, or it could be like the strength of it as a contributing factor could be like highly dependent on many other variables.
Context.
Blah, blah, blah.
Okay. Fine. Like so I think that that's a fair like criticism of the language that I'm using. I think and presumably that language is used very inconsistently across science.
Yeah, I think so. And I think that probably accounts for some of the...
In some fields of science, when they say biologically determining, they're probably using it like,
it's not like there have been scientists who have in the recent past, and there probably still are scientists who think who have, to me, seem like crazy ideas about like biological determinism, like really strong statements about things. About,
so I should be using somehow weaker language, though. That's like kind of a conventional term, even when used in a weak form.
Yes, it's just like I really want to like reject certain things like very strongly, like at the outset, to differentiate myself from certain kinds of arsehole. You know what I mean?
You want to be the right kind of asshole.
I suppose, yeah.
The pedantic kind.
But yeah, I mean, I think, so yeah, in headlines you'll see things like nature versus nurture, when any reasonable scientist knows that both things contribute. And so it is hard to speak succinctly about these topics without seeming like you're overstating claims.
Or oversimplifying,
Yeah.
Okay, but like, given all of these caveats, I don't know, Grace, what is your motivation in this topic? And then we can dive in.
I do have an interest in the extent to which, and this we won't actually get into that much, like the extent to which there are strong differences in genders and what behaviors are kind of robustly have gender differences versus which ones happen to in like the Western societies that they were studied in originally and that kind of thing. So I do have an interest in the nature versus nurture question about gendered behaviors a bit.
But okay, like to be clear, right? To me, tell me if I'm wrong. The only thing that can mean and make and kind of be coherent is like, we know that human beings exhibit massive variability. We know that human societies exhibit massive cultural variability, and that cultural variability can include massive variability in terms of the roles played in that society by the people who have, like, the large fraction of roughly half of the people who have penises, and the large fraction, roughly a half, of the people who have like vaginas, right? And then there are other people too, right? But like, the roles played by those two sets of people, males and females, can vary. Okay, and to me, the question that you just posed is, you could say, like, in all possible human societies, what are the boundaries on the variability?
Well, not boundaries, but what are the tendencies in the distribution
you could
of behaviors?
Characterize the distributions, right?
Yeah,
for example,
that's
maybe
description.
There are like, you can quantify some set of behaviors, and you can say, like, we know there's going to be variability, whatever, amongst all the individuals, but maybe there are like average differences, and maybe there are, and then also maybe to use slightly mathematical language, maybe the support of the distributions is like, different for, like, there could be things that, like, but I mean, I guess that seems pretty unlikely, but there can be things that humans can't do, and there could possibly be things that, like, women never do or something, or I mean, that's probably very unlikely, but yeah. Okay, so this is what we mean, right? Kind of characterize distributions or something.
That's one way of so Connor, you've now criticized both of our answers without giving your own, which is fine. But like, is there a subspace of questions on this topic that you actually find interesting, or is it just, I don't want to think about this question because it's politically charged? I mean, is that
no?
Kind
it's not
of
that I don't want to think about it. No, I mean, there is a thing where it's like, how important do I think certain topics are? But whatever fuck does importance mean there, it's just totally personal, kind of. I find it somewhat interesting to wonder about. So there's salient things, like there's sexes. There are usually two sexes. That's very saliently clear. That seems to be the case, right? And then I guess, are there? But there are differences in behavior. I mean, like, we know this already, so it's not like, I don't know. It's just like, what is the interesting thing, really?
We can observe differences in these distributions for a wide range of behaviors, and the thing that I'm interested in is, how would those distributions change if society could somehow be removed?
But like,
which it can't. I mean, of course, it's like it's interacting. So the question is, in some sense, like, I mean, to try to rephrase and bolster the legitimacy of that question, right? It's like, not necessarily with removing society, but like, kind of what is there that would be, regardless of society, you can think about it as like any society puts pressure on different behaviors across genders, maybe reinforces some behaviors as dimorphic. Like, how much are certain behaviors characterized by like so deep an innateness that different, like, like even in very different societies, it would require like enormous pressure to change certain behaviors in, for example, males versus females. So like, I don't want to read too much into this, but like as a plausible example, given the papers that we read in the macaque, in the rhesus monkey study, they speak about infant interaction as one measure of sexual dimorphism, basically.
Like that young female macaques enjoy interacting with infant macaques more than young male macaques enjoy interacting with them.
And so I won't, like, I'll just repeat what they said without, like, I'm not fact-checking this deeply, but their statement is that in these monkeys, there's like a 5-to-1 ratio of, like, females spend 5 times as much time interacting with infants as males do. And they claim, by reference, that this holds in humans. And I haven't looked at that reference, but so that would be like one example where, if it's true, hypothetically, that across societies, females tend, and this is true for primates and presumably less true, I don't know, for humans, maybe it's equivalently true for humans, females want to spend more time interacting with infants. That would be like interesting if true. I mean, I'm not like buying too much into it per se. I mean, it seems robust as a finding in animals.
I guess it's interesting. I mean, it's just like...
So why is it interesting? Maybe it's not like...
Humans aren't animals, right? So it's kind of like...
Well, that's...
They're not those...
They are.
They're not like... They're very different to other animals.
Sure.
We don't... I think it's like wrong to think of them as too... Or not wrong. I mean, they are animals. Obviously, I think they're fucking animals. I think I'm totally an animal. Like, in this... I'm very annoyingly irrational.
You're almost bipolar about this topic, it seems like.
No, in a way. Like, but it's just that they... okay, so... Whatever. It's like, okay, let's say it's a general thing where females want to play with babies more or something. I think that's just such a simple... Like, I guess this is the point, maybe, is that we're always talking about these distributional things, and when you make these like one-line statements, usually they just characterize the mean. And I think maybe there's something about like categorical thinking or something. When people hear these, as the sentence that says, like, if you have a sentence that's got a greater than or less than in it, like males,
like females, or females tend to play with infants more than males, basically.
Yeah, that could underlie an enormous difference, or it could underlie a tiny difference. It doesn't tell you anything about the variability. It doesn't tell you anything about the variability, like in a given population or between populations or across time. Blah blah blah. So, like, to me, it's like, unless you have much more detail, the statement kind of doesn't justify anything, really. Like, in terms of, like...
Well, it's not... There's a difference between justify...
No, I know, but justification comes into it almost, like, inevitably. Because there will always be... Unless you live in a world where there's, like, total kind of lack of major power imbalances between people of different kinds, of any systematic sort, right? So, like, for example, males and females, they're historically in lots of societies have been major power imbalances on average between males and females. So unless you live in a world that doesn't have any of that kind of, it's just always this thing where I'm not saying you shouldn't say it, but I do think there's a certain kind of responsibility that comes along with...
Yeah, but okay, we're getting into this at a very deep level around like every statement we're making on this topic, and I think that's a valuable digression, which is essentially what you're saying is that, like, why do we feel like we should be making any of these statements? And so I'd like to, like, at least attempt to motivate why this is, like, not as problematic. I mean, it is problematic for all of the reasons that you've elaborated. But there's a sense in which, to me, it's almost a kind of... People want to know, maybe purely for voyeuristic reasons, but also maybe to feel psychologically like they have a sense of what other people are like. They want to know things about the distributions of things and people. Like, why are surveys and polls interesting to people? It's because they want to have a sense like, well, what do other people feel? Yeah. Right? And I think these are charged topics, and they feel very fundamental. Like, you know, you interact with people, and you just want to have a sense like, what are people like? I think there's a naive and playful way. I mean, I realize that this can very quickly lead to sort of oppressive tendencies when imposed as norms. But like, and so I'm not trying, like, you can be sort of, I could be like cheery in this conversation and say like, oh, let's just know about the differences. But then like in the next conversation, it'd be like, oh, you know, now that we know those differences, let's make, you know, political policies that reflect the fact that there are those differences. I mean, and I'm not, but ignoring that for a moment, I mean, I think that there are maybe I'm wrong. Like, maybe the right answer, if we want to keep things fair and equal for all individuals, is to just not know these things, because if we know them, but I don't really believe that. I mean, I think that we can have this knowledge and use it responsibly, but also I think that there is just a curiosity to this, and it's like almost like voyeurism, right? We just kind of want to know a bit about people generally because it's interesting to us. I totally
agree with that. Yeah. Like, yeah.
I feel about it the same way that I felt when I was young and initially getting into things like psychology and neuroscience. There's a sense of like, we do things and it's not clear why. And like, you know, I think most people who take intro to psychology are just like, oh, cool, like I'm understanding myself and I'm understanding the people I care about and that kind of thing. Like, it's it's just general understanding. But I do agree that it would be nice if it could be done in a bubble that isolates it from the external world, at least until things are settled a bit, because if you let things out too early, they go into this highly reactive environment where they get amplified and distorted, and it feels like it's dangerous to even say anything then.
I think that's right. I don't, so to be clear, right, my concern is not actually, it's, of course, I think all things are of like legitimate things to study. I mean, unless it requires harming people to study them or something. But roughly, right? I'm sort of all for like general curiosity and attempts at understanding. I'm trying to make. I think my criticisms are more actually to do with how to do good science around topics that are politically and socially charged. I think the fact of a topic having a kind of an important social history to it, which is probably true of all scientific topics, can often be should, I suspect, often be taken into account in order to do better science.
Yeah, I mean, so I agree. I think let's move to some of the scientific details. I mean, we've had a lot of interesting, I think, sort of meta discourse around this topic.
I can't help but talk about these things in like a meta way.
I like that our whole point of this episode, which was to actually get to the science, has been sidetracked. I guess it's impossible.
Yeah, no, but and I think that like that's a nice like. I don't know if it's an allegory or a parable or if it's just but like we can't even get to the science on this because it's too politically loaded. Like even just the three of us talking about it, it's as though we've been stymied.
Well, let's just say that every sentence from now on is implicitly prefaced with, this might not be right, and we don't want it to affect things too much, but...
Let me make one more quick statement, okay? Because you said this thing of, like, you go to a psych class and you want to know, like, what are we like, right? Mm-hmm. And of course, like, everyone can relate to that, can relate to that feeling of, like, wanting to understand what human beings are like. And so I just think there should be, like, modesty and kind of historical awareness about our own efforts to understand ourselves.
Yeah, fine.
That's all.
That's reasonable.
Here. Okay, so...
Oh, and caution when you're telling the youth, right, how people are.
Oh, God,
right?
yeah.
If you don't want some old fucking fucker being like, oh, you know, like, the women have to be, like, you know, whatever. Like, that's the old
I read a paper that macaque females love infants, so therefore my wife's not going to work.
Exactly.
Yeah, and of course, when, like...
contemporary versions of that, too.
And if, like, a white male professor over 50 is telling that to his female undergraduates, there's, like, of course, a social context to that, right? I mean, I get it.
So for the rest of this conversation, let's remove social context and try to just speak about the science that we're aware of. Okay, so So the review paper, I mean, it does start off with, as I said, this guy talking about kind of some of the information he's gleaned by working with transgender people. And so I'm glad that we brought up all the caveats and confusions. And yeah, this isn't about transgender people. It just happens to be the case that some of the disorders that are used to get at how sex and gender are related, you know, they involve people who were assigned one thing at birth and chose to change later, and so it becomes relevant to have that perspective. So yeah, so maybe we can start just to set up an explanation for some of the natural experiments, quote unquote, that he talks about in the review. We can explain very briefly kind of sexual differentiation in utero. I guess I can do that, but
go ahead, Grace.
Right. So, so females generally have 2 X chromosomes, and males have X and Y. And so, in development, initially, a embryo is considered, what was the word? It has like bipotential. It can be either male or female for the first, I want to say 2 weeks. I might be wrong. But so it has these kind of structures that will become genitalia and other sexual organs, but they're the same in males and females to start with. And then the sex-determining region of the Y chromosome, which is called SRY, it's part of the chromosome, so it leads to the production of proteins, and those proteins cause the testes to develop in males. And from then on out, the testes are producing hormones that interact with other tissues to masculinize the embryo. So basically, as I said, the Y chromosome produces a protein that creates the testes. Then the testes start to produce something called AMH, which basically turns this embryo that had it had the potential to be either gender or either sex. It kind of shuts down the female side of things, and then testosterone is released by the testes, and dihydrotestosterone. Those seem to be kind of the 3 major things that contribute to different parts of the masculinizing process. So testosterone leads to more of the internal sexual organ development for men, like the vas deferens, and dihydrotestosterone relates more to the external genitalia. And so basically what this means is that in the absence of this part of the Y chromosome, the embryo would continue on to female typical development. And it's the presence of this part of the Y chromosome that shuts down all the female active stuff and ramps up all the male stuff.
And so there's this notion, I think this is interesting because, I mean, one thing that we had briefly spoken about is there's like some sense maybe that like some of the language in medicine is biased like against females or something like this. And while that's true in certain sort of social settings, they're like here the language is that like female development is like the default path, and that like males deviate from that by, you know, releasing something. And I mean, it's not my inclination to necessarily think about, I feel like I'm only thinking about this in the context of like what's the social context of this, because I've heard that the language is often like biased against females, and this one feels like fairly neutral, or like if anything slightly biased against males, but I'm not really inclined to say that because it feels like it's just kind of...
And also you could say that default is female, or you can phrase it however you want, but it's just the facts are that this part of the Y chromosome acts on the developing embryo in a certain way. But the thing that I heard related to this is something like literalist Christians didn't like it because in Adam and Eve, like Eve comes from the rib of Adam, so like the male should be the default or something like that.
So there you go. I mean, there is this context where like apparently some people who are chauvinistic or patriarchal, you know, think that the male should be the default and the female should be derivative.
Yeah. But I just wanted to say, so this makes 2 points, which is kind of that you can call it the default path is female, and you need to masculinize. And secondly, that the actual importance of the Y chromosome seems, that gets this whole thing going. But then mostly what's talked about in terms of impacting differences along sex lines is the hormones that are produced. And so the fact that every cell in your body has a sex, quote unquote, that it's either XX or XY, potentially isn't as relevant as it might seem like it would be. Obviously, there are circumstances where people looked into, how do these differences affect different kinds of cells in the body, but a lot of the major effects that we associate with sex differences seem to come from the hormones, not from the genes directly.
The first sort of things are, the way the body is and the type of genitals, right?
Yeah. So that kind of sets up how things work so that we can understand the types of disorders that have basically allowed for some splitting of maybe genitalia and hormone environment to kind of be able to separate some things, because basically it's hard to study differences or the relationship between chromosomes and sex and gender in humans, because generally, as if you have this sex determining region of the Y chromosome, then you're going to be producing certain hormones, and that's going to lead to certain genitalia, and that's going to influence how you are, the sex and gender that you're assigned, and how you're treated throughout life. And so all these things are so related that you can't tease them apart naturally, and we can't do artificial experiments to tease them apart in humans. So that's why people have turned to certain disorders that have arisen naturally in the environment to be able to tease these things apart.
The tendency in these disorders is that either certain hormones that are supposed to be produced, or certain molecules that are supposed to be produced at certain times aren't produced, or that, for example, receptors that are supposed to receive a signal from one of these sources, one of these molecular sources, is malfunctioning or mutated. And so, often in these disorders, a certain stage of sort of the standard developmental timeline is blocked. And that has, obviously a cascade of effects subsequent to that point in the trajectory. But it starts somewhere and is possibly somewhat localized.
Yeah. I mean, obviously, it's hard to know exactly what's going on in these disorders. But, so for example, a general class is androgen insensitivity, meaning that the tissues aren't responsive to the presence of things like testosterone. I think in this case, they're still responsive to the thing I said, AMH, which leads to the more some of the internal development, because they don't have properly functioning female internal organs. These are XY people, so they would be male, but because of this disorder, they don't have properly functioning female internal organs, but they have basically a vagina instead of a penis. And so when they're born, they are frequently assigned female gender based on the genitalia, but then they're actually they're XY, they're genetically male.
But the indication for these people is that they tend to be very comfortable, with a sort of female identity and or sexual, the sort of standard heterosexual orientation in that setting.
Yeah. So they're usually assigned female, raised female, and they seem to frequently be attracted to men, so they would be kind of heterosexual female, and they don't change genders at high rates compared to some of these other disorders. So I think the number was around 10% of them will change genders.
Do you guys think this kind of thing of why do we call these disorders matters? Do you think is that bullshit?
Yeah, I understand what you're saying. I think when I say disorder, I just mean rare thing that changes the course
That's not what disorder really connotes.
Yeah, I know.
Yeah. But like, do you think that's important? I mean,
so I think like every part of this language is like socially problematizable, but I think that this is not unique to this.
Yeah, I'm not saying it's unique.
Right, it's a standard medical thing, which is like anyone who is deviant, you know,
in medicine,
in medicine is classed as being
disorder.
Yeah, I mean,
you could say the same. So you could ask the same question, but those of like mental.
Like, and I think it's true of things that are sort of obviously life impairing, like diabetic people, right? Like people with juvenile.
Feels very reasonable to call it disorder. Right?
I mean, these people have.
And this is something that is mechanistically similar in that it's like a malfunction genetically that causes some deviation in a developmental trajectory.
I think though the key component is, does it cause a difficulty in functioning of some kind? Because, you know, we all have different genes that lead to differences, but in these cases, I mean, they have obvious reproductive issues. I mean, if you have a vagina and not a uterus.
So, for example, if you were an XY person who your entire life thought you were a like healthy female, you might get married, be sexually active as a female, have a heterosexual orientation, and then realize you can't have a baby.
You can't have kids, and that annoys you.
Yeah.
You won't have babies.
And
I
so,
think
like,
there are signs prior to that, but yes.
But yeah, I'm
It's
okay.
like-
Yeah, I was exaggerating, but I mean,
the standard thing to say, which I think is not like total bullshit, but what's a problem to someone in their life depends on like the world they live in, right? So
Yeah.
if we live in the future where we grow all the babies in test tubes,
then it won't matter.
then it won't be a disorder. Or something.
Yeah. So these conditions, that's probably a good word.
I'm not trying to police your language. I'm just talking.
you are trying to police the.
I'm not.
You're trying to police the
I am
whole conversation.
acknowledging-
I hate people who police language. I'm definitely not trying to do that.
Okay.
I just
No,
think it's an interesting thing.
Yes, I think it was an interesting thing to bring up as well.
All right, you're going to delete that part, I guess. Okay, continue.
Yeah, so there's kind of a fine point here, but I'm going to make it one because I think it came up as relevant in the book we read for the last episode, Brainstorm. And so that is that these people with androgen insensitivity, their body is still producing androgens, so the body is producing testosterone, but that testosterone doesn't really have anywhere to go because the tissues aren't receptive to it. And so they end up with excess testosterone, which the body can actually turn into estrogen. And so they also have high levels of estrogen. And in rodents, high levels of estrogen can actually be defeminizing. And so that led to some confusion and interpretation of these conditions where they're androgen insensitive and so have high testosterone and high estrogen. But it turns out that aspect of estrogen doesn't hold up in primates. So lots of estrogen doesn't have an effect of making anything more male. That was something that was only true in lower mammals and rodents. And so that's an example of where this doesn't hold the use of lower mammals. So it seems like in these gender-related things, you should be looking at studies that look at, if not humans, non-human primates, ideally.
Yeah, and I think it's even more complicated than that. I mean, we talk about it as though primates are a better example. I mean, as one side point worth bringing up is that, like, even in the case of primates, it's like not the case that everything translates to humans. For example, baboons have estrous swellings and are like sexually receptive, especially at certain times when they have this swelling. Obviously, human females have cycles for sexual reproduction, but it isn't the case that their receptivity is as strongly modulated as it is in these primates.
So there always needs to be caution, and as in any kind of animal research that is meant to be informative of humans, it's good to have kind of a feedback loop where you figure some stuff out on lower mammals maybe, but then check in with higher ones, and if it's not lining up, then you know that the lower mammal studies might not be so relevant. So another one that I think is interesting is called something with a lot of words, 17-beta hydrosteroid dehydrogenase deficiency. And what this is again, it's someone who's XY, and they, in the early differentiation stages, like I was talking about, where the testes produce hormones that guide the development of other tissues, they have certain cells that cannot produce testosterone. So this leads to a female-like external genitalia, so they're usually raised as female, but then the different cells later on are able to produce testosterone. So this is a more isolated condition where the prenatal environment seems to be different, but then later the hormonal environment later on becomes more typical of XY. And so in these people, when they're assigned and raised female, about 50% of them change genders to male later in life, post-puberty, I believe. So this is kind of related to this idea of organizing versus activating. So there's a sense that the prenatal hormonal environment organizes the brain in a certain way, such that later hormonal exposures, like the kind that happen in puberty, will activate it to produce gendered behaviors. And so this is showing, at least the way that I think you're supposed to interpret this, is that if the brain, the prenatal environment is such that it's in a more feminine environment and the person is raised as female, 50% of those people will stay female even when a more male environment happens later, whereas 50% will change. Although the complication with all of these is that they didn't make it clear if these people are receiving hormone therapy, which you think they might be if it's known that, you know, they're XY but being raised as female. So that's a complication, obviously a large one.
Okay, so I mean, kind of, there are other points made in this review that I think are interesting. For example, there's sort of a brief dismissal of some of the science related, for example, birth order and sexual orientation, which is like, you know, like I would say like a popular kind of conventional thing, but I mean, basically the claim is it's not very strong science.
They kind of dismiss the birth order thing with sexuality. They also talk about certain areas of the brain that were thought to be sexually dimorphic, but the way they describe it, it seems like a lot of those studies
fail
don't
to
replicate.
Reproduce. Yeah.
Yeah.
So that was also actually a very interesting point, right? So I'd even heard about in a neuroscience class as an undergrad some of the hypothalamic nuclei of a certain brain region that are discrepant between men and women, and there's some, I think, interest in like finding brain regions where homosexual men have similar properties to female, you know, brains.
And it's usually size and neuron number that are being looked at, which are pretty crude measurements.
So it's like, oh, there's this region in the hypothalamus that's like large in heterosexual men and like smaller in women and homosexual men, or something like that. And like, you know, some of that science is like, I mean, maybe it's true, but a lot of it seems a little bit irksome, and a lot of it is like not done with like a clear sense of what the purpose of those distinct. It's just kind of like stated as though they're finding like signatures, and it's therefore unbiased. But actually, the lack of understanding about what those regions do often makes me feel like less clear that it's anything other than kind of a sort of phrenology.
Noise.
Yeah. Right. It's like the people are like trying to grasp, and a lot of this work is old, and so like, especially when reading through these kind of these kind of literature, I find that it's like awkward because you're seeing like there were some people in the 70s or something who did like a study, and often that's the last time someone's checked that.
Yeah, it was really weird, this literature, like the citations, so it's like, when they come from and everything.
There's this hypothalamic nuclei that's bigger, according to some study in 1977, that hasn't been replicated. I'm making up the date.
Or the one time that it was replicated, it didn't replicate.
Exactly, yeah. So like someone tried to do it again in the 90s, and they found that it didn't seem to be true. So like, I mean, some of this science just seems kind of suspect.
There is the one region that they talked about here, and maybe this is just because this is more recent and hasn't been shown to not replicate yet, but the human bed nucleus of the stria terminalis is larger in males, and this is one that doesn't actually show a relationship with sexuality. So before, they were kind of looking for these ones that are homosexual men look more like women, and this one doesn't have that. Regardless of sexual orientation, it seems to correlate with gender identity, because female to male transgender people had male type. Well, there was only one person that they looked in that, but male to female, they had more people, and they have female typical, the size of this area and the number of neurons. And in animals, it's supposed to be related to maternal behavior. So this one has a little bit of a mechanism potentially related to it, and isn't about sexual orientation, but is about gender identity. But again, probably needs time to fail to replicate.
Well, no, I mean, it's clear that there will be, obviously, I think we expect that there will be some of these things that are real. It's just, until, a good, sort of thorough story is developed about them, it feels like we should be careful. That's all.
Yeah, of course.
There's a guy, do you guys know who Bruno Latour is? He's like a famous sociologist of science. And he's I think he's famously critical of science or something.
Yeah,
although I'm reading a book of his now and it doesn't seem that critical, actually. Which I think it's funny.
Well, but you're deeply cynical, right? So if you were...
Oh yeah, you think I think science is also so I just totally agree with Bruno.
You're just casually reading this with the same malaise as all of the sort of humanities scholars feel towards science.
But it's actually interesting because he's a bit whatever. He's one of these critical people, and he actually wrote an essay a few years ago, which was really interesting, where he was just basically, and he writes in a quite casual, a very haughty but somewhat casual style. It's really interesting. It's funny. But anyway, this essay was kind of saying have you noticed the way a lot of these critical ideas that I myself have been part of developing over the last decades have kind of become fucked, kind of. He basically was saying this whole enterprise seems to be a bit of a dead end, and we're kind of only hurting things, and our ideas are being used by really right-wing people, and it's kind of disturbing to me. And he kind of basically makes the very nice point, which is just he was always kind of intending to study science with the mind to making it work better,
and it's devolved exclusive into criticism or something like that,
or so, yeah, or just kind of, yeah. I don't know. It was interesting because I don't know. I think that kind of thing all the time when I read these kind of things. Why don't let's more.
It's hard.
Yeah,
science is hard.
Not the science is just hard, but I think I like all that critical work. I think it's really interesting and thinking about how science works and stuff. I don't like the attitude that sometimes exists that science just goes on as it does, and we can think about how it works and we can try to change how it works and so on. But it was just interesting to hear him, this person who's considered super critical, to be I was trying to help and I think that it's not working. That's funny. Anyway.
You should send me that essay. I'd read it.
I could put the link online.
Yeah. But also send it to me because I don't look at our website.
We'll do that.
So do you want to talk about the macaque paper?
Yeah, that sounds good.
Okay, so what it is that if you inject basically the mothers as they're carrying female children, you give them testosterone. Some of that will get passed on to the child, and so you can measure the effects of applying testosterone to the female fetus or embryo, depending on the stage, and see what happens. And so they did this for different levels of testosterone and for different periods of the pregnancy to investigate. And basically, depending on when you do it, you might actually create male genitalia in the female, or the genitalia won't be affected, but they can still look at differences in behavior. So what did they find?
Essentially, if we summarize the paper, which itself surveyed a lot of interesting work, essentially there was an early phase and a late phase, where if androgens were presented in the early phase, the anatomical changes followed. So basically the genitalia was masculinized, and in the later phase, the genitalia were kind of set and they changed, but not very much. So they were only slightly changeable in the later phase. more like size and things like this a little bit. But the behavior of the animal changed. Whereas early phase, but no late phase androgen exposure resulted in or limited behavioral changes. Let's approximately no behavioral changes, but if I'm being slightly extreme, like very limited behavioral changes, but a lot of this anatomical change. So the one thing that was like kind of core and actually quite interesting about this is essentially that this dissociated some of the behavioral and anatomical findings. I mean, of course, it's more complicated in humans, where like if you have some non-standard anatomy, it may affect the way you behave due to sort of psychological reasons and the way you fit into society. But like in this context, there's at least something which is, I think, interesting in this context, that like you could have anatomical sort of masculinization, but not masculinization of behavior, or vice versa. So there's a clear dissociability between those things in this animal.
Mm-hmm.
And what are the masculine behaviors?
So they did observe these macaques to get a sense of what kind of behaviors are associated with different genders. And so one thing was vocalizations. These animals naturally vocalize and call to each other, and they described the female vocalizations as more like cooing sounds, and if they were separated from the mother, the female vocalizations would last longer. This kind of like back and forth between the child and the mother when they're separated would last longer for the females, and there were some other effects of the vocalizing. There was also the type of play, so the males had more high energy play and more mounting behavior than the females. And as we said before, the females showed more of an interest in spending time with infants and spending time with adult females. And they also looked at the extent to which mothers treated male and female offspring differently, and they suggested that there weren't strong differences there. Maybe some small things related to grooming, or they said that if the male child was separated from the mother and calling with these vocalizations, that the male would be retrieved faster, but I think they were attributing that to the difference in the sound that was made, that the male call was kind of more effective at getting the mother's attention, not necessarily maybe that the female was doing that because it was a male child.
Although that would mean that the males would always be picked up quicker.
So it's a
which, from their point of view, is a difference, right?
Yeah, yeah.
And don't they also play with males' genitals more or something like this?
Yeah, they said that it was inspecting or grooming the male genitalia. The mothers would inspect or groom the male genitalia more than the female.
You know, this whole thing of like, how do people choose what to look for, right? Like, I thought it was funny that they mentioned that mothers will inspect the genitalia of males who have larger penises for longer. Do you notice that?
Well, that's because there's more to inspect.
I see. It's just like,
no, I don't know
why did they think of measuring? Like, that means someone that means that someone sat down, like, got out a tape measure.
Yeah, I mean, I was thinking about this too, because this came up also in the context of there were males that were exposed to androgen blockers in the late stage, so their anatomy was somewhat fixed, but they said that like their penises were smaller when exposed to androgen blockers in the later stage of development. So first of all, worth noting that was a salient thing that both you and I noticed. Exactly. So like when we're reading this paper, we decided to bring up these topics. But
yeah, this is the one thing I've mentioned.
This is the only thing you thought about. You just read the whole paper, and it was they were playing with the larger penises. It was. I was thinking about the research methodology of this and how it would be sort of interesting and weird to be one of these researchers who's like tasked, probably like some undergrad or grad student who's like tasked with measuring the size of a population of monkeys' penises under different circumstances.
Yeah. You do what you have to do for science.
Indeed.
Right. But yeah, this one also kind of tried to do the ideal experiment that I would like about changing the society that people, the macaques, were raised in. They said that there were different groups of raising that they tried raising them just among their peers, so it was kind of like, was that Lord of the Flies? Like there's kids stuck on an island. And then there was a rearing situation that included the pairs of mothers and infants. And so I think the conclusion from that was mostly that the behavioral differences in genders remained even in those different rearing situations. So that's, again, supportive of the idea that they have to do with androgen exposure, potentially. At least not so much to do with the things that we talked about the mothers potentially treating the different genders differently.
Wasn't there some finding about what are they called, monkeys, not having sex when they were...
Oh, yeah, the macaques that were raised only with their peers, so Lord of the Flies, they did not develop the males didn't develop normal sexual behavior. I don't know if they elaborated on that exactly, but if they're raised in mother-infant pairs, they develop normal adult sexual behavior.
Something like Oedipal going on, you know?
Yeah, well, I mean, the mom is spending a lot of time inspecting.
Yeah, exactly. You need your mother around, like, fiddling with your larger-than-average penis so that you can become a, you know...
I think it might be time to wrap up.
Whatever. Okay. Fine.
I'm glad that we did actually get into some of the science this time.
Yeah, no, that was an interesting conversation.
Yeah.
It does seem fun, I guess, to study sexual stuff.
And with that should be how we wrap. Thank you, Connor, for the summary of our feelings on this topic.
Yeah, no problem.
Till next time. Hey, if you're still listening to this, you must really like us. So how about you go to iTunes or Stitcher and rate the podcast, give us some feedback. You can also go to our website, unsupervisedthinkingpodcast.blogspot.com. You can comment on different episodes, or you could give us ideas for new topics you want to hear about. We would love to hear from you. Thanks.